Our first speaker today is a friend of mine for, 40 years. Wonderful friendship. And he's been part of the Schumacher Society for well over a decade. I don't know when that began because I wasn't there. Herbert Girardet. He's a filmmaker, he's a writer, and these days in particular, he's a true expert sought around the world on sustainable cities. Years ago, Herbie, when he was filmmaking more frequently, he and I made a lovely film about the Amazon called Halting the Fires. Nowadays, as I say, he goes around the world and advises on building sustainable cities. And it started in particular with going to the city of Adelaide when they started a Thinker in Residence program in 2005. And Herbie was the very first speaker. And since then, Adelaide has achieved absolute wonders. I mean, it's a real example to the world. And he's done other work in London, in Vienna, in other cities that I forget, but never mind, there are lots of them. So the theme for today came out of discussions with Herbie, and it was very much along the lines of his thinking's been going that we can do a bit more than sustainability. That's a concept that's been around since the late 80s, I guess it was, when Brundtland Commission came up with the thought. And it's just that we can probably go a bit further. So to introduce this idea of going beyond sustainability, very proud and pleased to introduce Herbert Girardet.
Well, Nick, you are truly a wonderful friend, and we have been sort of battling for not just sustainability, but on many other themes, I think, together for many years, and so I'm delighted that you are now chairman of the Schumacher Society. It's really great that we have such an energetic and determined and a person who's really, absolutely determined to change the world. So thank you for your introduction. And here we go on the topic of today, which is, can we still take the concept of sustainability as a guiding concept for decision making? Is it becoming outdated? Is it becoming almost irrelevant? Is it becoming like a rubber band that can be stretched in every possible direction? Is it enough? And I suggest that we need to probably think about regenerative development rather than just sustainable development at this moment in time, because we have degraded so many ecosystems, watercourses, we are damaging the atmosphere, we are in need to regenerate simply rather than to sustain what's already been so badly degraded. So here we go. Yeah, so I just want to start with what we've just heard from Darren, which is wonderful news about Bristol being green capital. And I think certainly the time, that's 2015, isn't it, Darren? So that really will be a huge opportunity, but also a challenge, because certainly, the spirit of greenness in Bristol is, really extraordinary, and it's a wonderful city in terms of its intentions. But the question is now whether the enabling processes to make a green city happen can also be generated, and that partly has to happen at the local level, but I will certainly talk about the need also for national policies to enable things to happen at the local level. So the Green Week last year, exactly a year ago, helped to kick the process off, and Darren was one of the key people in that process of organizing that Green Week, the great big Green Week, which is now starting again today. And I think it will be a great week because of the fact that the announcement has just been made. And here's one of the key people in this process, and I think one of the petitions that should go out from this room here today is that George should not continue wearing red trousers, but from now on I think we should ask him to wear green trousers. Because as somebody here, some people may not know, but George Ferguson, the mayor of Bristol, has for many years just been wearing red trousers, and that's his trademark, so we need to change that trademark, I think, a little bit. Anyway, he's a great guy, and it's amazing to have a mayor with such an independent spirit and, not belonging to either the Conservatives or the Liberals or Labour. So he's a remarkable man, and I think we'll come tonight at the end of our lectures here today to maybe still be participating. I'm not sure whether he's able to make it on time. So, my outline of my presentation. Basically, what I'm arguing is we need, as I already briefly said, we need to move beyond sustainable development. We need to get serious about regeneration. And I think that message needs to go beyond urban areas to the national policy, international policy-making processes. So I'm talking about cities as economic centers and how they, to a great extent, determine what is happening on this planet. And the impact of cities and lifestyles of urban people on the planet, I think, is a key factor in deciding the future of the planet. So then I'm talking about a concept that I've worked on for some time. Three key concepts of the city: agropolis, petropolis, ecopolis. Looking at various examples of that. And then we're living in an age that's now being called the Anthropocene, which is the age in which humanity, to a large extent, determines what happens on the planet. And the ecological footprints really affect the way humanity lives on this planet. And then looking at whether we need to expand the concept of urban ecology. Cities as villains and as victims, global limits of urbanization. Cities as change agents. I mean, a lot of creative people live in cities. Can cities be at the leading edge of the regenerative development revolution? And then looking at Adelaide and then moving on to the idea of ecopolis and so on. So here we go. The concept of sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And as I already tried to indicate, it is becoming a little bit outdated, partly also because it's been usurped by so many interests, including companies like BP talking about sustainable profits, for instance. You know, that is really quite a bizarre situation. Sustainable growth is a term that's widely used. So sustainability really is becoming quite a tired term, even though we are just, the United Nations just initiating a process called Sustainable Development Goals for the planet. So one has to see how the concept of regeneration can be brought together with sustainable development in a meaningful way. So I'm suggesting that sustainable development aims for an environmentally enhancing, restorative relationship between humanity and the world's ecosystems. That's how I'd like to argue for the rest of this talk. So, just a few images. As Nick said, I used to be a filmmaker, so I like using images to kind of illustrate points because, the old story of 1,000 words, images being 1,000 words or so. So here's 4,000 words. Basically, the history of the Industrial Revolution changed everything. Suddenly we are in an age in which the use of fossil fuels totally determines not only our transportation, our production, but also our urban systems. And these are the sort of realities of urban life today: globalization of all production processes, dependence on fossil fuels to power our cities, our lifestyles. And then the externalities of urban life here. This is the other end of the spectrum, the horrendous pollution that comes out of our cities, and how to deal with that is one of the major challenges of a renewable, regenerative world that we need to head towards. So here's the concept of agropolis. This is the kind of town and village of the past, embedded in its local landscape. This comes from the work of a 19th century German geographer called Heinrich von Thünen, who argued that in the absence of major transport systems, cities and towns had to be embedded in local landscape, in market gardens. The town forest needed to be nearby because timber and firewood is heavy, can't be transported over long distances if you only have horses and muscle power to rely on. And then further out towards the end of the urban region are the lower, less dense cultivation systems, three-field rotations and rough grazing and so on. So in the absence of major transport systems, cities had to be embedded in landscapes in this way. And here's a few sort of pictures, 17th century prints showing, the towns surrounded by fields in this way. And certainly that can still be found in different parts of the world even today, particularly in Asia. In Britain, we still have villages that look as though they are sort of embedded in their local landscape, but in reality, particularly since the enclosures, a separation process has taken place between human settlements and the landscapes around them. So the grazing land around a village like this in Yorkshire belongs to a farmer rather than has a direct relevance any longer to the life of the village or indeed the food supply to the village. Now, London, of course, was a great pioneer, a wonderful city. I lived in London for many years, but it was a pioneer in unsustainable development of the first order. It was the first city to grow beyond 1 million people, growing from 1 million people to about 8.5 million people by 1939. And so certainly it is an amazing place and a wonderful cultural and center of so many different types of aspects of the life of this country and beyond, but certainly the question of how London pioneered unsustainable development needs to be looked at. And I spent quite a bit of time in the past studying this sort of metabolism of London and its ecological footprint. And London sort of set a pattern for mega urban development elsewhere in the world. Now look at the central island there, which was, that's what it looked like about 30 years ago, and that's what it looks like today. You know, that's the new Manhattan of Asia, and it's just astonishing. That used to be farmland. I went to Shanghai for the first time in the late 80s, and that was still an area with sort of farm fields, you know, horticulture and vegetable crops being grown there. And so total transformation of the spirit of the city. And similar processes are taking place as well. One point that is important to say is, on the one hand, you've had this massive urbanization process and the enormous amounts of concrete being poured in a city like that. On the other hand, Shanghai as a city still today administers an area of some 300,000 hectares of land for the production of vegetables for the city. They like their stir-fried vegetables, as we know, and they need to be fresh, and if they're brought long distance, they would have wilted. So there's still 300,000 hectares of land around the city of Shanghai that is used and that's administered by the city authorities. So imagine Bristol administering part of Gloucestershire, part of Somerset, for the specific purpose of supplying food to the city. So that's still a bit of a utopia, I would say, but who knows? Maybe George Ferguson can change all that in the years to come, together in this, with us all in this collaborative process that we heard about from Matt. Look at Dubai. This is what Dubai, the landscape around Dubai looked like about 40 years ago. This is look like today. This is the same street, main thoroughfare through the city. Of course, the world's tallest tower, 750 meters. Incredible example of unsustainability, far surpassing anything that London has achieved. And of course, total dependence on desalinated water. I've been working a lot in the Middle East recently, and I've totted up there are 120 desalination plants on the Gulf Coast and on the Red Sea coast, because you couldn't possibly have a city without water, and there's no water there, basically. That's where in the past there was no urban development to speak of in the region. So these are the ecological footprints of our cities that stretch far into the distance. Nick mentioned the Amazon, where we together made documentaries in the late 80s. And the transformation of a landscape like here on the bottom left to what you see in the rest of this slide is what is ultimately the ecological footprints of London and Paris and New York and Rio de Janeiro. And so these realities really have to be addressed when we are serious about a regenerative world. This is in Mato Grosso, in the southern end of the Amazon. There used to be cerrado grazed by emus and some forests there as well. Now it's the largest fields on the planet, 150,000 hectare fields just for the production of soybeans. On this massive input of diesel power to cultivate the land. And that ultimately feeds the cows and the pigs and the sheep that end up in the Tesco's or in Sainsbury's. And then the other side of the coin, which is the pollution coming from cities, the water pollution from cities into coastal waters. And the issue is not only the clouding of water, reducing the growth potential of coral reefs or seagrass meadows, but also the continuous loss of nutrients, nitrogen, potash, phosphate, that are required to keep our farmland productive. And so this transfer of nutrients from farmland through our cities, to coastal areas, is a critical issue of concern for the future of this urbanizing world in which we live. So the ecological footprint of cities, it's only a small proportion is actually the areas that are built up, the habitat land, the built land. Much of it is the areas required to supply this food, but ecological footprints are also defined as places that have to be set aside in order to absorb the CO2 coming out of our cities and our modern lifestyles. So London's ecological footprint, this is a study I did some years ago. I came up with a figure for roughly London's footprint being the size of the UK, pretty much the productive land of the UK, but London only has 12% of the UK's population. So where's the other land that feeds us? So these are extraordinary realities that we have to address. So what I'm suggesting then is we don't live in agropolis any longer, we live in Petropolis. And Petropolis is, of course, the place where fossil fuels are the central input into our urban systems. And that certainly is a highly unsustainable situation, not only from the fact that this stuff is not going to be around forever, but also we all know about climate change and these related issues. So this is the world from satellites. A picture couldn't have been taken 30 years ago, both in terms of the fact that we didn't have the technology, but also because the world was never lit up in that way before. So all of these dots of light are either cities or the flaring of gas from power stations, from gas oil fields, or indeed, the flares from power stations. So, just to kind of summarize some of these points, human numbers went up to 7.2 million. That was announced 2 days ago, that we're now 7.2 billion people on this planet. So that was a fourfold, just over fourfold increase in the 20th century, but a 15-fold increase in world urban populations. And that trend of urbanization, which is roughly half the world's people at the moment, is going to go up to about 70% if current trends continue in the years to come. In Europe and America and elsewhere, it's already 85%, in the Middle East, 90%. But the most important point, or 2 points, are that certainly people say that cities are the solution to the world's sustainability problems because people are clustered together quite densely. They require less transport than people in rural areas and so on. And certainly the ecological footprints of urban and rural people in developed countries are very similar. But when it comes to developing countries, people moving from a village in China and India into a city, their resource consumption per capita typically goes up fourfold as they move from being rural people to being urban people. So these are major issues to be addressed in policy. How we can, if we are serious about an urban future, can try and build cities that don't have that effect of massive increase in resource use per capita. But the final point here, cities on just 3 to 4% of the world's land surface use the bulk of the world's resources and emit the bulk of the world's waste. So we all know about CO2. We've just reached 400 parts per million. For the first time, about a 40% increase in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. We know about the effects, floods, unstable weather patterns, such as here in the Colorado River, which feeds cities like Los Angeles and Phoenix, Arizona, and Las Vegas. Half the water that used to be there is now there, and droughts, there was major fires there a few days ago, and so on. So the imbalance between an urbanizing world and the biosphere is a critical issue to be addressed, and that certainly means how can we find ways, if we are serious about continuing to burn some fossil fuels, how we can also enable the biosphere to absorb far more of the CO2 concentrations, emissions, from our fossil fuel burning than we currently do. So there's a newly emerging science called urban ecology, and my suggestion here is that we can no longer concentrate just on cities themselves in trying to understand urban ecology. We need to think beyond city boundaries and to include the ecological footprints of cities. And ultimately, we need to find ways and means of creating a mutually beneficial, regenerative relationship between urban populations and ecosystems. So I've been working quite a bit on the concept of the metabolism of cities. And typically, a modern city operates like as a linear system, as you see at the top there, with resources going in and waste coming out the other end. But nature operates as a circular system. All wastes produced by nature become inputs into future growth. The leaves that fall off trees in the autumn, become nutrients for the growth of trees the year after and the many years after that. So if we are serious about wanting to live in an urbanizing world, we better learn from nature how to deal with, the input of resources back into the urban, into nature systems. There's quite a bit of work now going on this concept of regenerative development. This is from New Zealand, where this concept has really been very actively adopted. And I'm just going to concentrate on the last bullet points on the right-hand side there. Basically, the critical issue is this question of how we can create and restore capacity of ecosystems and biogeological cycles to function within human management, to understand the diversity and uniqueness of each place as crucial to the design of urban systems, and see the design process as ongoing, indefinite and participatory. So we need to move on from Petropolis into another type of urban system, which I call here ecopolis. And that means certainly learning as best we can from the past, but we cannot simply recreate the past unchanged. That would be an illusion. We have new technologies, we have new opportunities, we have new scientific methods of organic cultivation that have only emerged in recent years. We have solar, wind technologies to power our cities from their rural hinterlands, and that is certainly of critical importance in creating the city of the future. And so much of the rest of my talk will be dealing with those issues. And Nick already mentioned I was involved in work in Adelaide, it was 10 years ago in 2003, where basically the mayor of the city, but also the Premier of South Australia said, we are faced with water shortages, we are faced with pollution problems. Let us rethink the urban system of this city region of 1.2 million people. And so we had a 10-week very, very intensive process of some 3 seminars a day and lectures every day. It was very, very intense indeed, to try and to rethink how a city of this proportion could work. So this is just a picture of the city with low-density suburbs. And as a result of policy changes in recent years, really major changes have happened. So first of all, they have introduced public transport, trams, and I know in Bristol there's been a struggle for many years to get some tram systems underway, and maybe under the auspices of the green capital city, something like this will finally be able to happen, because it's certainly happening in other cities in the UK. In Adelaide, they have the first solar-powered bus, this bus on the bottom right-hand side there, which is powered, of course, not just from solar cells on the roof of the bus, but from solar cells on the roof of the bus station. So that is very exciting, and there are several of those now operating around the town. They've built solar villages within the city. They have a massive increase in renewable energy development, not only solar, but wind as well. They've insulated a lot of buildings, and the government and city authorities refuse to use any buildings that are not well insulated now. And they've looked at the waste management issue. And here is the differentiation between technical nutrients and biological nutrients that are very, very important, because we have many outputs from our technical systems that nature cannot digest effectively. So how can they be returned to production systems, industrial production systems, rather than be dumped in nature? And here's one example, plastics. Until recently, all plastics in Adelaide were dumped in landfill sites or washed into the sea. What they're doing now is turning the large proportion of the plastic waste back into materials that are actually long-lasting, the way plastics, actually are. Plastics are a long-lasting material, so why not use them as fence posts, as as benches and so on and so forth. So this is a very useful way of using plastics. And so certainly that is being taken very seriously in the zero waste initiative that was initiated in Adelaide. Take the organic waste of the city. It used to be dumped again in the landfills are producing a lot of waste gases, methane gas in particular. Here. So they have the largest, one of the largest composting facilities anywhere in the world now, 180,000 tons of the organic waste of the city being turned back into soil for cultivation on the edge of the city. And they're also using wastewater, such as in the top right-hand side there. They have a pipeline from a wastewater facility, to grow crops using both the compost from the city as well as the wastewater. The soil there is very thin and very fragile, so it's very important to keep it, to regenerate it through giving back to the soil the nutrients that come from the carbon within compost and from the nutrients from the sewage system. And so you have a wonderful crop of vegetables being produced there using these types of systems, which have effectively contributed in a major way to the regeneration of some 20,000 hectares of land on the edge of the city. And here's just a summary, and I won't read all these points, but they have massive new development of renewable energy as a major part of the development. But very importantly, the argument that we used in Adelaide 10 years ago, if all this happened, it would be of very major significance to the economy of the city in terms of the job creation potential. Because if you don't import gas or oil from halfway around the world in order to burn it in power stations that power your city, but instead you have solar panels and wind power on the edge of the city, in the vicinity of the city, then obviously you bring jobs back into the region. And that, I think, is of great relevance also for the future of Bristol as well. And a very important additional point was in Adelaide that major reforestation initiatives were started, partly to stabilize eroding soils, but partly also to help sequester carbon from the cars that obviously still operate within the city. So some 3 million trees have been planted. And also dramatically increasing the surface area of the landscape, because every tree has up to half an acre or so of surface area from its leaves. Whereas if you cut the tree, you end up simply with the surface area of the soil that the tree stood on before. So policy is very important, not only in terms of local participation and kind of world cafes and of the kind that many of these have been held in Bristol in recent years. But for instance, if you do not have national policy to make renewable energy happen, you're going to find it very, very hard to implement that at the local level. So feed-in tariffs as a policy which was pioneered originally in California, actually, and then in Denmark and in Germany, has had a major contribution to both, massively increasing renewable energy within a country like Germany, but also then, of course, for city regions. And that is of great relevance also for the Bristol area. Feed-in tariffs, of course, were introduced under Gordon Brown, but have been toned down to an extent that it's much harder to make a cost-effective investment any longer. So that has resulted in major changes, feed-in tariffs that is, have resulted in major changes in technology. Wind power 30 years ago was typically 50 kilowatt machines, now there are 5 or 6 megawatt machines. Remarkable progress in technological development. And then solar power, similar developments have happened in that context too. PV panels have become much cheaper in recent years. New kinds of architecture has emerged, all on the back of feed-in tariffs as national policy, as I said. Here in Freiburg in Germany, a set of houses that produce far more electricity than they actually use themselves. Opportunities for new electric transport technologies, or not just bus stations, but parking spaces where you can have recharge the electric batteries of your car. So these are all opportunities that arise from new renewable energy technologies. New types of transport systems also in terms of cycling. And here in Bristol there's a major discussion on building a new stadium. Well, here's a model I think that should be looked at in Taiwan, which is a solar power station of a stadium in this city called Kaohsiung, which is obviously, it powers the sports games that go on in the stadium, but also are a permanent power station. So I think if the stadium on the outskirts of Bristol is likely to be built, we should certainly look at this as a kind of model. It's also quite beautiful in my view. Other technologies in Spain, here Seville as a city is largely powered now by solar electricity, again from the region, from the outskirts of the city. So we need integrated regenerative urbanism, and that means a global, national and local context. We need to weigh the cost of action against the cost of inaction. I mean, the Stern report showed very, very clearly inaction on climate change is an ultimate economic disaster, not just an environmental disaster. So certainly we need much greater clarity about the importance of acting today rather than acting in 10 or 20 years' time. We need new partnerships between academia, community groups, NGOs, and so on. And wherever possible, we need carrots rather than stick to make the changes happen. We need global environmental regeneration for local benefit. That's very important, that it is not seen as something abstract out there that ultimately don't relate to people's lives. So the collective self-interest as well as long-term altruism are major factors in what should happen. So just a quick look at Bristol as a very dynamic city, lively city, also the city of this wonderful artist. You know, the irreverence of the people of Bristol very clearly comes out in a drawing like this. But certainly the challenges are huge. Buildings are often very inefficient in terms of energy use. We need to be very clear about the hierarchy of what is most useful in terms of investment, in terms of demand reduction, energy efficiency, and renewable energy, and be clear about which are the most effective and cost-effective investments to make. We need to look at the new opportunities in insulation materials. This is a material called aerogel, and you have the flame below and the rose above, and it doesn't wilt. Why? Because this is one of the most effective insulation materials that you can use inside buildings rather than outside buildings. And that certainly is of great importance because people don't often want to put insulation on the facades of their buildings. So if you can put something inside a room without losing much living space, that is the really useful technology. And there's a few others of those becoming available, again, of great relevance for Bristol. So solar development has started here. We have some methane being used for operating cars. We have allotments, and urban agriculture is beginning to happen in the region. But ultimately, the future of Bristol is not just of the city itself, as I already tried to indicate, but it needs to include the region around Bristol, new types of partnerships between the city authority here and the local authorities in the neighboring counties, I think, are of importance if one is serious about a better give and take relationship between Bristol and the countryside around. Farmers in Britain are beginning to become not only pig farmers or sheep farmers, but also solar farmers, providing electricity, and often that will end up in cities, and so certainly there is of great significance for the future of the region. And the sheep can still carry on grazing even between solar panels like here. So coming to the end of my talk here, just a few glimpses of the new technologies that are also available for the Severn Estuary. You know, it's of remarkable importance to have wind power development rather than just looking at the opportunities in here and in the Severn Barrage. So to kind of come to the end, then, the critical issue for creating regenerative cities is that we don't just take as urban people from nature, but that we really find ways of giving back in a regenerative way. That includes energy systems, soil regeneration, plant nutrients, regenerating forests and watersheds, and very importantly also rebuilding human attachment to nature. And then very, very important at the end, rekindling community, as we already heard from Matt at the beginning. And that certainly has happened in Bristol in recent years. And one final point here at the end is in Curitiba in Brazil, they have public displays about the effects of policy, in this instance, paper and wood recycling, and how people's participation in that process is shaping the environmental performance of the city. So that, I think, is a really great significance to have stuff like that going on in Bristol as well. And the final point, any offers on what this picture is about? the internet, a supporter of the internet. Global communication allows cities across the world to be in touch with each other as never before, and so these types of ideas really are of being adopted increasingly across the world in a mutual learning process between city authorities and city people everywhere. Thank you very much.